I want to wrap this up by talking to Michael Shermer, who has offered to come on this show. Mick West has offered to come on the show. He did so very early on, and I politely declined. And I'm going to politely decline, at least for now, for Michael Shermer. And Michael, if you're listening, this story best illustrates why I do not want you on my show. 6 months prior to my mother passing, she had been telling me for a few months that she had something she wanted to tell me. Now, when I was 15, she told me that when she was 15 and growing up in suburban Dallas, she was sitting on the porch of her parents' house watching the sunset and saw a UFO fly by in the distance. I remember her vividly telling me that when I was 15, and she said she was 15. So Michael, 6 months before she passed away, which was April 2nd of this year, she said, I have something I want to tell you. And to be honest, I thought it was bad health news. She had been ill for quite some time. And I wouldn't be doing this show if it weren't for her. And she said to me, after some missed meetings of where I was trying to go back to Dallas to see her, she said, well, there's something that I've been wanting to tell you. And I only told your dad about this 2 weeks ago. So you're the only person to hear this. And it went like this. She said, you remember when I told you the story of when I was 15 and I saw this a UFO fly by in the distance? And I said, yeah, Mom, I remember that. And she said, I didn't tell you everything. And I said, okay. And she said, this thing wasn't in the distance. It was 50 feet or so away from me, and it was right above my neighbor's house across the street. And I sat there in silence. And she said she was sitting there watching the sunset. And she said it was like a magic trick. This 40-foot long gray cylinder materialized on the other side of the street, right above the neighbor's house. And this gray cylinder had a long rectangular window in it. And in the window, she said there were 10 beings. She wasn't into UFOs, didn't have a UFO book, didn't watch any UFO shows. And she said in the middle of these beings was a pilot. And she said the pilot was in the middle. And I said, well, what was the pilot doing? And she thought for a second, and she said, well, he was studying me. And I said, well, what were the other ones doing? And she said they were behind 2 benches, just sitting there. But the pilot, who she said was taller, was looking right at me. And I asked her, I said, were you afraid? And she thought for a second, and she said, no, actually I wasn't. And I said, well, Mom, what did you think they were doing there? And she said, I think they were there to see what was going on. She said, this pilot was studying me. And I said, well, what did the pilot look like? And she said the pilot had a moon face. And I said, what do you mean by moon face? And she said, well, you know, kind of round. And I asked her, well, what did the eyes look like? And she thought for a second, and she said, well, I think they were pretty normal. And I asked her the kind of usual stuff. Did you have any missing time or anything like that? And she thought, and she said no. And I asked her, did this thing fly off, or what did it do? And she said, no, it just kind of vanished the same way it appeared. So Michael Shermer, a couple months later, I go home back to Dallas, and I set my cell phone up on the dining room table, and My mom rolls up to the table in her wheelchair, and I ask her to recount that story. Well, I'm recording this on my cell phone, and she tells me exactly the same exact story. And then I bring up on my laptop these two black and white line drawings that kind of look like a police lineup. And one is like a collection of different reported UAP aircraft. And then the other one is a bunch of different NHI beings, or whatever you want to call these things. And I put these up on my laptop, and I first put up the lineup of all the different craft. And I said, Mom, what did it look like? And she put her finger out and started going across the screen, and it took her about a minute. And she finally said, that's the one. That's pretty much what it looked like. And then I said, okay, and I brought up the other one where it had, I think, probably like 30 different types of NHI beings. And I said, Mom, what did the pilot look like? And that one took her the longest. That was probably a couple minutes of her going and looking at each one. And then finally she extended her finger out and touched the screen, and she said, that was it. That was the one. I can tell by his eyes. And I asked her, had she had any other weird things happen when she was a kid? And she said, you know what? Sometimes at night, the sun would come in through my window. And I said, what do you mean, Mom? And she said, well, sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and sun would be streaming through. And then she goes, sometimes the sun would be red. And I said, what do you mean by that? She said, well, usually it would look like the sun, but sometimes it would be red light coming in through the window. So I said to her, well, was there a traffic light or anything behind the house that could have shined in through your window? And she said no. I asked, after she passed away, I asked my two living uncles, if they had ever had anything happen, and they said no. The other story Michael Shermer, my mother, told me in all of this was, during this whole thing, was when she was 6 years old. Her granddad was in town. She grew up in a family of 5, and her granddad came in for Christmas Eve, and all 4 of her siblings absolutely loved their granddad, and they all slept with him in bed on Christmas Eve, and my mom was snuggled up against him. And she woke up in the middle of the night, and at the foot of the bed was this glowing being that she couldn't make out any kind of face, and it scared her. And I think she said she was 5 or 6. So she wakes up her granddad and says, Granddad, there's something at the end of the bed. And her granddad wakes up, and she tells him this. And of course, he can't see anything. So she asks him to describe, he asks her to describe what's at the foot of the bed. And she says it's about the size of a person. She can't make out the face. And you know what her granddad tells her? Tells her, honey, that's your guardian angel. Go back to sleep. You have nothing to worry about. And she went back to sleep. And a couple hours later, she woke up and this thing was there. And she went back to sleep. So after telling me all of this and recounting the story of what she saw that appeared above her neighbor's house 50 feet away on the other side of the street, I asked my mom this one question. Mom, after it went away, did you go in and tell your parents? Did you go in and tell your 4 other siblings? And she looked at me straight in the eye. I'll never forget this. And she said, no. They would have thought I was crazy. So Michael Shermer, my mother, her entire life kept this to herself because of people like you. Because of people like you and Mick West and others who mock people like my mother, who mock people that experience things happening to them in their bedroom. She carried that her entire life, her entire adult life, Michael Shermer, until she was 6 months away from leaving this world. And she finally had the courage to tell one of her sons and her husband, and she kept that to herself out of shame for what other people might think about her. So Michael Shermer, that is why I will never have you on my program. Because the damage that people like yourself do to the mental health of individuals that encounter this terrifying shit, people like you, Michael Shermer, are the reason my mother kept that to her in her entire adult life, because she was afraid of what people would think about her. She was afraid what her parents would think about her. She was afraid what her siblings would think about her. Her entire adult life, she didn't tell anyone, not her siblings, not her parents while they were alive, not her kids. Why? Because of the stigma that people like you, Michael Shermer, propagate and profit from. That is why I will not have you on my show. That is why you do not deserve a seat at the table with Dr. Avi Loeb and others.